It was well past midnight when I finally arrived at the Elmwood Hotel. The journey had been long, the roads winding through dark, unfamiliar territory. By the time I reached the hotel, I was utterly exhausted, my eyelids heavy, and my body aching from the hours spent behind the wheel. The Elmwood was the only place I could find in this remote area, a grand old building that seemed to have been plucked straight from a different era. Its faded brick facade and dimly lit sign were barely visible in the fog that clung to the night. I stepped inside, grateful for the warmth of the lobby, which contrasted sharply with the chill outside. The place was quiet, eerily so. The front desk was manned by a single clerk, an elderly man with thinning hair and a weary expression. He looked up as I approached, offering a tired but polite smile. "Welcome to the Elmwood Hotel," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "How can I help you?" "I'd like a room for the night," I replied, my voice sounding just as tired as I felt. The clerk nodded and reached for a large, dusty register on his desk. He flipped through the pages, his fingers moving slowly, almost methodically. After a moment, he looked up at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Not many guests this time of year," he remarked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "But we do have a room available. Room 714. He handed me an old-fashioned key, the kind with an ornate metal tag attached. The number 714 was engraved on it, worn but still legible. "Your room is on the 7th floor, the clerk said, pointing towards the elevator at the far end of the lobby. "Enjoy your stay." I thanked him and made my way to the elevator, my footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. As I rode up to the 7th floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hotel had a strange, musty smell, and the decor was outdated. Faded wallpaper, dim lighting, and threadbare carpeting that seemed to belong to a different time. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a dimly lit hallway that stretched out before me. The walls were lined with old paintings, their colors muted and their frames tarnished with age. The carpet underfoot was thick, but the pattern was faded and worn in places. I glanced at the numbers on the doors as I walked, each one labeled with a brass plate. 710, 711, 712. But there was no sign of room 714. The hallway seemed to go on forever, the lights growing dimmer the further I walked. Just as I was beginning to think I'd made a mistake, I spotted it. A door at the very end of the hallway, almost hidden in the shadows. The brass plate on the door read 714, though the numbers were slightly askew, as if the plate had been hastily attached. I hesitated for a moment, a strange feeling of unease settling over me, but I was too tired to care. All I wanted was to collapse into bed and get some rest. I inserted the key into the lock and turned it, the mechanism clicking softly as the door swung open. The first thing that struck me about room 714 was how old-fashioned it was. The furnishings were all impeccably clean, but they looked like they hadn't been updated in decades. The bed was a massive four-poster with heavy drapes that hung down on all sides. The wallpaper was a deep burgundy with an intricate floral pattern, and the carpet was a rich, dark green. A large wooden wardrobe stood against one wall, and an ornate vanity with a round mirror occupied the opposite corner. The room was illuminated by a single dim lamp on the nightstand, casting long shadows across the floor. There was a television, but it was one of those old boxy models from the 1980s, sitting on a wooden stand near the foot of the bed. The air was cool, almost cold, and there was a faint smell of mothballs and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Despite its age, the room was spotless. The bed was neatly made, the linens crisp and white. The wooden furniture gleamed in the soft light, free of dust or grime. It was as if the room had been preserved in time, untouched by the years that had passed outside its walls. I set my bag down on the bed and let out a deep sigh of relief. My exhaustion had overtaken any feelings of unease I might have had, and all I could think about was getting some sleep. I quickly changed into my pajamas and climbed into bed, the mattress firm but surprisingly comfortable. As I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the room. It was too quiet, too still, as if the air itself was holding its breath. But fatigue won out, and before I knew it, I had drifted off to sleep. I don't know how long I slept, but I was jolted awake by the sound of a phone ringing. The noise was sharp and piercing, echoing through the silence of the room. I sat up, disoriented, and looked around, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It was an old rotary phone sitting on the nightstand next to my bed. I hadn't noticed it before. It blended in with the rest of the room's outdated decor. The phone continued to ring, insistent and demanding. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something compelled me to pick it up. I lifted the receiver to my ear, expecting to hear a voice on the other end. But there was nothing, just silence. I waited for a moment, my heart pounding, but still, no one spoke. Just as I was about to hang up, I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible over the crackling static. "Please, help me." The voice was distant, distorted, as if it were coming from a great distance. I felt a chill run down my spine as I strained to hear more, but the line went dead. I quickly hung up the phone, my hands trembling. The room felt colder now, the shadows longer and darker. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was just after 3 a.m. The unease I had felt earlier had returned, stronger than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room, that something was watching me from the darkness. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a prank call, a glitch in the phone system. But as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the image of the voice on the other end, pleading for help. The television flickered on by itself, the screen filled with static. I bolted upright, staring at the old boxy TV in disbelief. The remote was on the nightstand, untouched. I grabbed it and tried to turn off the TV, but the screen remained lit, the static hissing softly. And then, through the static, I saw something. A figure, faint and shadowy, standing in the center of the screen. The image flickered and jumped, but the figure remained, unmoving. I couldn't make out any details, but it was clear that the figure was a person, watching me through the screen. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the screen, unable to look away. The figure began to move, slowly at first, and then more quickly, as if approaching the camera. I fumbled with the remote, my hands shaking, and finally managed to turn the TV off. The room was plunged into darkness, the silence deafening. I sat there in the dark, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of glitch, a trick of the light? But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something wrong with this room. Something deeply, terribly wrong. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep after that. My nerves were shot, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I needed to know more about this room, about what was happening here. I got out of bed and began to search the room, hoping to find something, anything that could explain the strange occurrences. I checked the wardrobe first, half expecting to find something hidden inside, but it was empty, save for a few wooden hangers that clattered together as I opened the door. The vanity was equally bare, its drawers containing nothing but dust. Finally, I turned my attention to the bed. I lifted the mattress, expecting to find nothing, but my heart skipped a beat when I saw it. A small, leather-bound book, wedged between the mattress and the box spring. I pulled it out, my hands trembling, and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and precise, the ink slightly faded with age. The first entry was dated nearly 50 years ago. July 3rd, 1972. I've checked into room 714 at the Elmwood Hotel. The journey was long, and I'm exhausted, but there's something about this room that doesn't feel right. The air is heavy, and the shadows seem to move on their own. I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the entry. It mirrored my own experience so closely that it was uncanny. I flipped through the pages, skimming the entries, and found that they all told a similar story. Guests who had stayed in room 714, all reporting strange occurrences, all feeling a sense of unease that grew stronger with each passing day. As I continued reading, I noticed that the entries grew increasingly frantic, the handwriting becoming more erratic. The guests reported hearing voices, seeing figures in the shadows, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Some entries even mentioned the phone ringing in the middle of the night, just as it had for me. But it was the final entry that sent a wave of cold fear through me. August 15th, 1983. I can't take it anymore. The voices won't stop, and the figure in the TV keeps getting closer. I've tried to leave the room, but the door won't open. It's as if the room is alive, trapping me inside. I don't know how much longer I can last. If anyone finds this diary, please, help me. Get out while you still can. The entry ended abruptly, the final words trailing off into a jagged line. I stared at the page, my mind racing. The person who had written this diary, what had happened to them? Had they ever escaped the room? Or had they vanished like so many others? A sudden knock at the door startled me, and I dropped the diary, my heart leaping into my throat. I stared at the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. Who could it be at this hour? And why did they knock so softly, so deliberately? The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly approached the door, every nerve in my body screaming at me not to open it. With trembling hands, I reached for the doorknob and turned it. The door swung open, revealing nothing but the empty hallway beyond. There was no one there, no sign of anyone having been there at all. The hallway was dark and silent, the shadows stretching out into the distance. I stepped back into the room, my mind spinning. The diary lay on the floor where I dropped it, the pages fanned out as if in silent accusation. I knew then that I couldn't stay in this room any longer. I had to leave, had to get out before whatever force was at work here claimed me as its next victim. I grabbed my things, stuffing them haphazardly into my bag. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely manage to zip it closed. I needed to get out of this room, out of this hotel, and as far away as possible. But as I reached for the door, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The room seemed to close in around me, the air growing heavy and thick. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist, reaching out toward me with grasping fingers. The phone rang again, the sound sharp and piercing in the silence. I ignored it, yanking the door open and stepping into the hallway. The air out here was just as oppressive, the dim light flickering overhead. I made my way to the elevator, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The ride down to the lobby felt agonizingly slow, the elevator creaking and groaning with every floor it passed. I watched the numbers tick down, my heart racing with each one. When the doors finally opened, I nearly ran into the lobby. It was empty, just as it had been when I arrived. The night clerk was gone, the front desk abandoned. I hurried outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the empty street beyond. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I got into my car and drove away, the tires screeching on the pavement as I sped down the road. I drove for what felt like hours, the hotel receding in the distance behind me. Only when I was miles away did I finally pull over, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. The hotel was behind me now, but the memory of that room, of the diary, of the strange occurrences that had plagued me throughout the night, would stay with me forever. The next morning, I stopped at a diner in a nearby town, hoping to gather my thoughts and maybe find some answers. As I sipped my coffee, I overheard a conversation between two elderly men at the counter. They were talking about the Elmwood Hotel. "You hear they're finally tearing it down?" one of them said, his voice raspy with age. "About time, too. That place has been a blight on this town for years." "Yep. the other man replied. Too many strange things happen there. People vanishing, stories of ghosts. Some folks even say there was a room that didn't exist. Room 714. I felt a chill run down my spine. I leaned forward, unable to stop myself from interrupting. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. "Did you say room 714? The men turned to look at me, their expressions wary. "Yeah," the first man said slowly. "Why?" I stayed there last night," I stammered. The men exchanged a glance, their faces pale. "You must be mistaken, son," the second man said. "That room's been closed off for years. They sealed it up after what happened." What happened?" I asked, my heart pounding. The first man sighed, shaking his head. "It's just a story, but they say a man stayed there once, years ago. He vanished without a trace, but not before leaving behind a diary. People who read it say it's cursed, that it drives you mad." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The diary, the phone calls, the figure in the TV. It had all been real. But the room itself, was it real? Or had I been caught in some twisted supernatural trap? I never found out for sure. But I knew one thing. I would never set foot in the Elmwood Hotel again. Some places are best left forgotten, their secrets buried in the past where they belong. As I left the diner, the sun shining down on the road ahead, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the outline of the hotel in the distance. But it was gone, as if it had never existed at all. And maybe, in a way, it hadn't.